Welcome back. So tonight we start off with the tragedy that took away 8 Ghanaians. You remember the President of the Republic directed the Acting Minister of Defense to constitute a committee or an accident investigation board to get into the issues that led to the crash that occurred on the 6th of August. The Z-9 GHF 631 helicopter flying from Accra to Obuasi involved in a crash at Dampia Forest Reserve of Adjekum, Brofuyedru in Adansia Krofum. All 3 crew and 5 passengers on board died. So I'm just going to run it through quickly what this summary presents. Now, it's important to note that the full report hasn't been made public. What we have been given is the presentation by the lead of the team that did the report. And this is in the form of 41 slides that he presented to the press yesterday. I'm going to run through some of the slides. Now, it talks about investigations under these regulations being conducted to determine circumstances leading to the accident and prevention of future accidents and incidents. So what it did was to give us factual information, analysis, conclusions, and then safety recommendations. But all these were done in terms of slides. We don't have the full document. The composition of the board had the National Security, Ghana Armed Forces, the US Air Force staff, as well as Aircraft Accident and Incident Investigation and Prevention Bureau. So those were the 4 main people. Now, what was their methodology? They did what they call factual information and evidence collection. That's the slide that started with a briefing by the Parliament investigation team, by the preliminary investigation team, handing over of the flight recorder and some personal effects of passengers, and visit to the accident site from 28th August to 29th August. Then they did what they call technical examination and data collection, which had 2 legs: maintenance records, flight logs and crew qualification, documents being reviewed, as well as FDR and CVR, flight data recording and cockpit voice recorders, transported to the flight decoding center in China. That was 12 September to 22nd September. They also did what they call human factors and operational information, where they looked at the medical and physiological records of the flight crew and conducted interviews with pilots and others. Then they also did what they call meteorological information investigation. They looked at weather information. They interpreted this using MET, ART, AF, and eyewitness observation, etc. They also did what they call an organizational and systemic review. And then they did what they call analysis and reconstruction. And then they had what they call findings and causes, as well as recommendations. Now, the scope was 7-fold. Basically, history of the flight, the weather, the machine, which is the aircraft itself, sequence of events, the cause of accident, organizational and systemic factors, and human factors. Now, I don't want to bore you with all the details, but I'll just give you a couple of slides on each subject. So, for example, on the history of the flight, we're told that there were previous flights by this same aircraft on 2nd August from Takoradi to Accra. 1-hour flight was what is called a Medivac. On the 3rd of August, there was an Accra Cape Coast Accra flight as well, 1 hour 20 minutes Medivac. And then on the 4th of August, 2 days to the fateful day, there was an Accra Salman Accra flight, 2.5 hours. This was cargo. Then they talk about weather. They showed slides on the weather, morning weather, afternoon weather, looking pretty hazy. They even had what they call the picture of en route weather from a passenger on board the helicopter to a friend before the accident. And then they basically said that the weather in southern Ghana was poor, which delayed departure for about an hour. They also said other things about the Kumasi weather being worse than the Accra weather, with drizzling reducing visibility to around 4 kilometers and heavy low clouds sitting just 600 to 900 feet above the ground. Very important point, only Accra and Kumasi aerodrome weather was available, they say in the report. They also say there was no information on the weather along the flight route available to the pilot. They say witnesses reported poor visibility due to fog and rain at Brofuyedru and its environs. And they also say the kind of rapid changes in environmental conditions over the terrain can result in turbulence, downdrafts, and other phenomena. They had a slide they call downdraft, explaining that turbulent wind currents usually occurring around ridgelines, mountains and hills, generating sink rates in excess of 1,000 feet per minute in moderate wind conditions, with a picture. They then assessed the machine. They spoke about its history, manufactured in 2012, reached its 10-year service threshold 18 May 2025. The aircraft received a 90-day extension to 18th August, which is 12 days after the crash. Essentially, it was on what they call a service extension, and I'm sure later on some of my guests may explain this, right? But they said this was with the manufacturer's approval. We are told that the aircraft on the day was declared serviceable and duly signed off by the captain. The FDR report indicated that the helicopter was in good working condition, but they also state that the helicopter, however, lacked some avionics safety enhancements, and they mentioned about 4 of them. Lack of key safety equipment, including what they call terrain awareness and warning systems, advanced navigation with terrain mapping, automatic flight control system, and stated that these safety equipment could have enhanced situational awareness. Even before finishing the analysis, they do a recommendation on this slide where they say, we have recommended strongly for aircraft with these additional safety enhancements to be acquired immediately. They then examine the human factors, ruling out incompetence or fatigue. Basically, I won't spend time on this because there was some speculation in the media that the captain may not have been in the right frame of mind. But they did say that to rule out any potential human causes, they examined the qualification, experience, and competence of the crew, and also their state and frame of mind. And they ruled out fatigue or any other thing. Then they do what's called the sequence of events, where they mention when the flight left. Let me just read those 4 quick paragraphs. The flight departed Accra under VFR in marginal weather. The flight to Brofuyedru was uneventful, approximately 90 nautical miles out of 100. At 9:56 or 09:56 a.m., the crew entered clouds and transitioned into IFR. All right. Seconds before impact, the crew stated they could see high grounds below. And then it says, suddenly after, the helicopter lost height without change of power or pitch attitude and impacted a ridgeline at 1,370 feet above sea level, about 6.5 miles from the destination. Then they show this flight path sequence of events. And then they talk about their findings. The helicopter was airworthy but lacked additional safety enhancements for flying safer in the weather phenomena over the terrain. Adverse weather, limited visibility, rising terrain, and no ground-based navigation aid en route. They also say emergency response was timely. Then they say the cause of accident was determined to be the sudden loss of altitude and lift due to the downdraft. This loss of altitude without change in power or pitch attitude was consistent with downdraft associated with the changing environmental conditions over high terrain. They also identify a number of systemic and organizational failures, limited navigational capability for en route and remote areas, enhanced training. There was no simulator training, no flight data monitoring, no secondary surveillance radar, automatic dependent surveillance broadcast. All of that was absent. Now, let me come to the safety recommendations, because my first guest will speak to those because he hasn't seen the full report, so he can only comment on the recommendations. So here are the safety recommendations as put out by the team. Modernize the fleet of the Ghana Air Force. Specifically, acquire modern aircraft with TAWS, EGPWS, and modern navigation systems. He will explain what that means. CVR and FDR with audiovisual capable ties. Acquire those as well. Acquire or invest in flight simulators for recurrent training. Contract certified aviation weather provider. Get en route navigational aids. Get flight data monitoring. Get en route tracking systems and ground support equipment. This suggests that all these things we do not have. So to help us appreciate what these recommendations mean, I have Associate Professor of Aviation and Aerospace Services based in the US, himself an experienced pilot, and also a flight crash investigator, Professor Kwasi Adjekum, to help us appreciate some of the nuances presented, particularly in the recommendations. Prof, thanks for joining us. By the nature of your work, I suspect you need to have seen the full report in text to allow you properly analyze this. Is this correct?
Yeah, that is very correct. And thank you for having me on your show. And just a point of correction, it's aerospace sciences, not services.
Aerospace sciences, forgive me. Aerospace sciences. Aerospace. I know there's a big difference there. Good.
Yes, aerospace sciences.
Wonderful. But having not seen the report, you notice I went through the slides that the team lead presented to us. Why is it important for people like you to see the full report?
Yeah, it's very important because as a researcher myself, as an aircraft accident investigator who has been in their position, the background data is very important. Like I stated earlier, a couple of months ago, that as the investigation, it's a very thorough data-driven process. So the conclusions that that is reached has to, you should be able to tailor it back to the underlying evidence. That's the data that was collected. And so sort of I'm hamstrung because if I don't have I cannot appreciate the underlying data. I just have to take whatever was presented on face value. And that's why my commentary is sort of, I'm constrained just to comment on what was presented by the team because I've not gone through the underlying data. I mean, for instance, I would have loved to have gone through the transcript of the cockpit voice recorder. I would have loved to see the plotted charts of the parameters. We call it like the aircraft parameter plots. The power settings, the flight control positions, the speed, the orientation. I mean, these are very important data points that will be helpful for me to sort of correlate whatever the conclusions and the findings and the recommendations were with the underlying data. Notwithstanding, I believe that I should be able to pick up snippets and especially focus more on the recommendation because I think that's very salient and we can take it from there.
Before we get to the recommendations, you notice that there was a slide which showed the scope, and the scope, at least the summary of the scope, was history of the flight, weather, machine, sequence of events, cause of accident, organizational and systemic factors, and then human factors. How comprehensive are those, and how important is it to have all those legs into an investigation like this?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think as I explained earlier on my chat with you in the aftermath of that accident, usually the first phase we deal with collection of factual data, which the team did, and I know, and I've been in their position. It's a very thorough, painstaking job, and I would like to say a big thank you to all of them. And so you collect the factual data. These are things that are undisputable. I mean, it happened, and so you collect it. Yeah, of course, you do some interviews with the date. And then, of course, another data point is the analysis of the data that was gleaned from the cockpit voice recorders and the flight data recorder. After all has been done, now you come to the analysis itself. This is where we normally use maybe an accident investigation model or possibly what we call taxonomies can help like to classify. And in this case, I, in my opinion, I think they were using what we call the 5M model. Okay, so because I heard them mention man-machine management, medium, which is the environment, and so I presuppose they use the 5M model, which is also one of the models out there for accident investigation. So looking at it, at least from the perspective of the slides, I think it's just in line with accepted practices, ICAO and X13 practices.
So one of the things we found out just reading the slides was that, of course, the aircraft had done flights on the 2nd, on the 3rd, and the 4th, which means basically it had done regular flights before the 6th. They obviously said the weather was bad, and we all knew this. And they said the weather near Kumasi was worse than the weather in Accra. They did state that even though the machine was cleared to fly, there had been an extension of its service. And I needed to read that point, that the aircraft was manufactured in 2012, entered the service in May 2015, and reached its 10-year service threshold on 18 May, but received a 90-day extension to 18 August. Now, without prejudicing anything, what does this mean in English? If you say that an aircraft had reached its 10-year service threshold, but received an extension with manufacturer's approval, does the threshold mean that it should stop working, or you need to bring it for servicing?
Yes, so And I think the lead of the investigator also highlighted it that even within industry, normally if a machine is manufactured, you operate it in accordance with the specifications and the laid out maintenance schedule of the manufacturer, which is also approved by, of course, your regulator. In this case, the Ghana Air Force obviously is not under Ghana Civil Aviation Authority. We have our own maintenance standards. And so a lot of times within a period, after 10 years, the manufacturer, as part of its reliability and integrity systems, the manufacturer requires you to bring in the aircraft for what we call heavy maintenance. So they'll check the airframe, they'll check power plant, they'll check systems on board, and that is already pre-laid out. What normally happens is that maybe due to operational constraints, remember, as part of reliability, they give like a percentage of failure, a percentage of operational reliability. And so if, for instance, you want to extend the time that you're supposed to send it in for maintenance, you have to work with the manufacturer and undergo some specific criteria or checks. And that is where they will grant you like an extension. But normally the extension comes with some limitation, which means that if the aircraft has been given an extension, there are certain operational capabilities that nominally the aircraft cannot be used for. That doesn't mean the aircraft cannot be used. Let me give you an example. So for instance, maybe you're using your car, is due for oil servicing, but due to some constraints, you cannot send in the car for oil servicing. Okay, that doesn't mean that the car needs to be shut down or you need to park your car. Most likely you can defer and say that, hey, maybe it's not a good analogy, but you can extend it and say that maybe next week I'll be taking it for servicing. That means that if you were supposed to, for instance, travel to Boko, most likely you will not use that car to travel from Accra to Boko. What you rather do is that, hey, you could use the car within your locality, within Accra, just get to work and back. So those are some of the constraints I'm talking about. So yes, the extension is an industry practice. Even in the airlines, they do it all the time. They give extensions, but you have to work with the manufacturer. And if it's in the case of the civil world, most likely it also has to be looked at by your inspectors. So maybe your airworthiness inspectors, to make sure that you are within the full compliance of the extension provided by the manufacturer.
When I listened to the man who did the work and read the report, he basically cleared the human factors, because he said they ruled out any human cause, they examined qualifications and competence, they examined frame of mind. I think you mentioned this earlier in our interview, that's also important. They said the captain was qualified, the co-pilot was qualified, and to rule out potential human causes, they examined the medical and physiological records, and they found that all three were well rested, prepared, and professional. And then they describe the sequence of events and talk about the downdraft. So it seems to me a lot of the blame is going to the weather. But I do notice that under the discussion around the machine, they said even though the machine was serviceable and airworthy, it lacked key safety equipment. And then they actually then made a recommendation on that slide, which is, they hadn't even gotten to recommendations yet. But if you look at the next slide after this, guys, they said that it lacked key safety equipment. They mentioned terrain awareness and warning, advanced navigation and terrain mapping, automatic flight control system, and then said that these safety equipment could have enhanced situational awareness. And then they said they have recommended strongly for aircraft with these additional safety enhancements to be acquired immediately. So it seems to me they are narrowing the options. The weather is obviously a part, but that they are saying that if the aircraft had more enhanced safety features, they may have stood a better chance. This is the way, this is my deduction as a layman. Can we make that deduction from what they put out?
So let me break it down. So basically, any aircraft, based on its role and the purposes for which it was acquired, I mean, that would determine the type of technology that we have on board. I think I've stated earlier that in aviation operations, we are dealing with safety controls. And they are normally branched. There are three areas. So we have technology, we have standard operating procedures, we have training. Okay, so these are the three key areas that we talk about. And so, talking about technology that is on board an aircraft, it's let me draw an analogy to you having a mobile phone. There are so many functionalities on your mobile phone. The basic use of a mobile phone is to communicate, is to text, maybe is to do some video chats. Obviously, you will have other features that sort of makes it sophisticated or enhanced. So yes, it's I mean, for these helicopters and the purposes for which they were acquired, if my memory serves me right, and based on my checks, at least some of them, or they came with the autopilot or the auto stabilization systems. But then that doesn't mean that if they are not working, especially on helicopters, it cannot be used. It's functionally not usable. The point is that if you don't have an autopilot on board, it increases the workload of the crew, because time that they need to constantly be manually flying the aircraft. And for human beings, repetitive tasks induces fatigue, which means that time that can be spent assessing the flight, critical identifying cues around, and to be able to make judgment, safety critical judgment, is spent on what we call motor skills, trying to hold the aircraft in altitude and in straight flight. And so that is where technology comes in to augment, especially the physical or repetitive tasks of a crew. And so if you have an autopilot system, it sort of reduces the cockpit workload, and then we can defer to more higher order safety decision-making abilities or capabilities in the aircraft. We are talking about the helicopter terrain awareness and warning system, ATOS. I think I mentioned it earlier when I met you. What that does is that, helicopters operate normally at very low altitude, most of them, visual contact with the ground. And so it sort of gives the pilot an idea of what is happening around them. Because in terms of situational awareness that you mentioned, it is the ability to know what is happening around you. And that helps you to be able to make a forecast of what will be happening in the next couple of minutes whilst you are in motion. I've just broken it down. And so if you have a technology that is able to map or is able to show you ahead that, hey, there's terrain whilst you are moving forward or sideways or whatever, flying through a high terrain area, it helps the crew in terms of their decision making to avoid those high terrain. Now they are talking about downdraft. Basically, I think he explained it yesterday that if you are operating around mountainous areas, we call them mountain waves, as the air flows around, the hilly areas, they are disturbed. We have what we call rotors, and that can cause downdraft, which sometimes can exceed the capability of the helicopter. And that is what the team is sort of alluding, that they got caught up in a downdraft, which resulted in they impacting the ridge. A little, probably area that I wanted clarification was that normally for an accident like this, the industry practice, we classify it as control flight into terrain. So I'm sort of scratching my head as to why the team decided not to use that term. Because from the narration that they were flying, they inadvertently entered clouds, which is instrument meteorological condition, when they were supposed to maintain visual, flight throughs, that's visual contact with the ground. And they were trying, from my deduction, they were trying to get out of that instrument meteorological condition. And in the process, they got caught up in a downdraft and impacted terrain. That is a classic classification of control flight into terrain. So maybe, like I say, if I had read the full report, then I'll be able to concur with them. But that's an area where, in my opinion, I think we may disagree. Because I would have classified this as control flight into terrain. But of course, I don't have the underlying data, so that's my opinion. And so this technology, they are great. I mean, if you have it on an aircraft, real-time, data, weather updates, as they suggested, automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, which shows position, altitude, and speed for flight following. both for the aircraft and for operational control command at the Air Force headquarters. It helps us to know where our aircraft is, because radar is limited. Radar is ground-based. So normally, due to line of sight and the need for the aircraft itself, the transponder to repeat and to get back to Accra, it can be limited. ADSB, and for instance, is satellite-based. So anywhere, once you have an ADSB on board, even if it's a remote location without ground-based facilities, at least some level of tracking can be done. So that's an area where probably we may disagree.
I see. For we, the laymen, when we saw advanced navigation with terrain mapping, automatic flight control system, and when we read that these safety equipment could have enhanced situational awareness, what we deduce is that if the aircraft was more modern and more equipped with these things, the pilot may probably have known earlier that he was closer to a ridge. Number two, it's possible that if there were some other things on the aircraft, it could have automatically reacted to the downdraft, because I'm told that this automatic flight control system, it's possible that it can still power the aircraft up if the downdraft is pulling it down. I'm not sure if that's something you can confirm. Again, just from a surface reading of the thing they said.
Yes, so basically, microburst, downdrafts, these are, the basic explanation is that if you have airflow over any form, over any feature, it's supposed to be streamlined. It's supposed to be the normal, regular flow. But as air goes over the hill, like I explained, and it starts rushing on the other side of the hill, the air becomes turbulent. And so it's like you put water in a sink and it starts circulating and becomes stronger. So it creates what we call rotors or eddies. The point is, in safety management, first of all, you don't want to get yourself in that position, because you are dealing with the forces of nature which may be beyond the capability of the helicopter or even the crew skill or knowledge. The knowledge is there. You know that, hey, when you are flying in mountainous areas, you are susceptible to mountain waves and turbulence. Okay, so as I would rather focus on things like pre-flight risk assessment tools or safety decision tools. Before the flight, you are going to Kwasi. So as part of your flight planning, if you know that you're going to be dealing with low cloud ceilings, most likely it's going to affect your visibility. There is high terrain in that area. As part of your threat error management analysis, you have to do the risk assessment and ask yourself, do you even have the helicopter terrain awareness warning system which will highlight high terrain? You don't have it. And so then the next thing that comes to mind is, what altitude will give me enough clearance so that inadvertently, if I were to be caught in a downdraft, I'll be able to execute what we call an evasive or escape maneuver. In this case, I don't know, and that's one of the areas where the briefing was a bit not clear, because it would have been great to know the altitude just prior to the point of impact. What was the altitude of the helicopter? What was the position, the orientation of the helicopter? What was the magnitude of the downdraft? Because on board the helicopter, the helicopter reacts to the prevailing or the ambient wind conditions. So it will be indicated, on board. The crew will have an idea that, hey, we have a tailwind, we have, a rapidly changing headwind. And so all those data will be captured on the flight data recorder. And that's why I wanted to have a look at it, the graphs. And that will influence, because that, hey, the aircraft orientation is changing rapidly. You are being pushed down. And normally the training requires you to execute what we call an evasive maneuver, which means maximum power and then trying to get yourself out. An autopilot, if you are an autopilot, most likely the way it will react, because if the aircraft is going down, the autopilot will react by trying to get the aircraft out of that situation. But that will be exceedingly aggravated. So normally, especially as a pilot, as part of our training, the pilot takes over control and manually has the power and executes the escape, or what we call the evasive maneuver. So yes, those tools are great. It can help you to anticipate, to see what is right ahead. But at the end of the day, I would have loved to know the reaction of the crew when they realized that they are being caught in a downdraft. What was the evasive? What was the action of the crew? What is the communication between the crew? That area is not very clear. It was not highlighted in the brief. And
Yeah, all they said was that flight was uneventful, approximately 90 out of 100 nm. At 9:56, the crew entered IMC and transitioned into IFR. Seconds before impact, the crew stated they could see high ground below. Suddenly, after the helicopter lost height without change of power or pitch altitude and impacted a ridge line at 1370 feet above sea level. So they just gave those 4 bullet points. They didn't.
Yeah, and for me, that doesn't provide enough clarity. I mean, the crew saying they saw the ground below, was it forward visibility or it was vertical visibility? Because sometimes you can see features below, but you cannot see what is ahead of you. Remember, they were in clouds, they were in IMC conditions. So that is where the helicopter terrain awareness warning system might be helpful, because prior to it maps what is ahead of you. So it will give you an alert that terrain, and at that point the crew will take the evasive action, that is rapid climb out. And so that is where technology can be helpful in terms of building the situational awareness of the crew. But the briefing is sort of short on the actions of the crew, the altitude of the aircraft, the magnitude of the downdraft, and whether the downdraft was such that it was beyond the capability of the helicopter, which rules out the fact that if, for instance, the downdraft was about 1,000 foot per minute or 1,500 foot per minute, that might exceed the climb capability of this helicopter. So obviously, even the most well-trained crew might find it very challenging to get out of that situation. And that will lead, obviously, to the control flight into terrain. I still maintain, in my opinion, that this was a control flight into terrain.
Wonderful. Let's end with the safety recommendations. Again, we just have about 7 of them, and it's basically around modernizing the fleet of the Ghana Air Force. It doesn't touch on other things, although it does admit that there are also organizational and systemic factors like limited navigation capacity for en route and remote area weather services. We need enhanced training like simulator and flight monitoring, data monitoring, and flight following surveillance radar. The main recommendations have to do with the need to acquire modern aircraft with certain capabilities and certain features. They mentioned having TAWS and modern navigation system, CVR, FDR with audio and all of this. Do you feel the recommendations are far-reaching enough based on what we've all discussed? Because it seems as if they are basically saying modernize your fleet, get aircraft that can do better sensing, and this will not happen anymore. What do you think?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Bernard. Safety recommendations should be pragmatic. It should be cost-effective. So all the things that have been listed, they are great. But I will even go beyond that, because remember we talked about organizational and systemic factors. Okay, and so that is where I will highly recommend what we call the safety management system, which looks at the organization as a whole. How does our safety policies influences our safety values, within the Ghana Air Force? Okay. You are talking about things like flight data monitoring. Flight data monitoring is just one component of what we call safety assurance. So if we buy all this technology, if we enhance training, how do we know the effectiveness of these things? It is by collecting data from these, and then we asking ourselves whether we are minimizing incidents and accidents, whether we are achieving our safety objective, which is to make sure that we fly from point A to point B and we come back safely with minimal risk. And so the data collection process is such that if all these aircraft are equipped with flight data monitoring recorders, or what we call collection tools, then every flight that is undertaken by the aircraft that we buy. Anytime they come back from flight, we collect this data. We have analysts who will sit down. They will look at it to make sure that they were flown within the recommended parameters in terms of speed, altitude, the orientation. Anytime there's exceedances, it is a call for us to maybe ask ourselves, what is happening? Why is it that our crew are overspeeding, or maybe they are flying below altitude or something like that, or maybe they encountered a downdraft on one of their flights? We take it back to our training, and then we create what we call scenario-based training, which could be done in a simulator. Or for helicopters, most of the times it is a bit challenging to reenact some of it, but at least for instrument procedures trainers, we could enhance the capabilities and the competencies of flight crew in the Ghana Air Force. Another aspect is safety risk management. And I've already talked about it. So flight risk assessment tools before the flight. What are the resources available to flight crew for them to be able to determine whether this flight is a go, or what we call go or no go? In this case, the captain went to check the weather. If he had had real-time flight support whilst he was en route, he would have known that, hey, getting close to Profiedu, the cloud ceilings were very low, the visibility is very low. I'm supposed to be flying visual flight rules, and that will proactively or preemptively help the captain to decide that, you know what, the risk is too high, I will knock it off, I'm returning back to Accra. And that goes into what we call the organizational factors, which empowers captains, or flight crew. It gives them the sole authority and the power to make safety critical decisions. It is not the pressure, I'm not saying that's what happened, but it shouldn't be pressure from anybody or any external entity.
All right.
It is the crew that should be able to make those safety risk decisions. So it's holistic. It's not just only about buying equipment. It's about looking at the safety management system of the Ghana Air Force.
I would like to thank you very much, Professor Kwasi Adjekum, Associate Professor of Aviation and Aerospace Sciences, and also an aviation accident investigator. We thank you for your insights.
Yeah, Bernard, and a quick one. I would want to also extend my condolences to the folks that were lost today in the LWAC accident. It's very unfortunate, and it just goes back to the fact that in every activity, we have to understand the hazards and apply safety risk management to forestall such accidents. So my condolences.
Thank you.